Hi there, everybody. It's Gail Burgess here from Traffic. Thanks very much for joining the latest Change in Demands webinar. Just going to wait a few more moments for others to join. We'll aim to kick off very neatly on the hour. And yeah, thanks very much, Josie. I can see your screen really clearly now, so that's great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, once more for joining us today. Really looking forward to a talk from Josie Chambers today, who's going to introduce her research study to us. Just a word and a request, I guess, if people aren't speaking, if they're able to mute their microphones at this point, that would be much appreciated. We'll be kicking off very soon, another couple of minutes. We'll just wait for a few more to join us. Yeah, won't be too much longer. Thank you. Hi there, everybody. This is Gail Burgess from Traffic. Really delighted you're able to join us today. It's just turned the hour, so why don't we kick off and give people a few more minutes, I guess, before we actually start with the main presentation for today. So welcome to this Change in Demands webinar. the first for 2019. Really delighted to welcome to the community today Josephine Chambers. I know Josie from the great work that she's been doing here at Cambridge University. She's a postdoctoral fellow here, and she is one of the co-conveners of the Human Behaviour Change Special Interest Group that's run in the David Attenborough building. She convenes a fantastic network of speakers who at sort of lunchtime opportunities share with us their research findings and their work, and so I'm really delighted today that she's been able to join us and share some of her own research, and I believe we're amongst the first to hear this presentation, so very fortunate that she's been able to join us. Josie will be introducing some findings. She's analysed 32 case studies of collaborative approaches from around the world that span 6 continents and operate at multiple scales. I think this is particularly interesting for its potential in using behaviour change as part of the suite of approaches being used for conservation benefit now across a range of different projects. She's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the learnings from this analysis of the case studies in the hope that this can help us in our project design moving forward. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Josie just to explain that the session is being recorded today, so hope that's okay for everybody, and there will be an opportunity after Josie's presentation for us all to ask questions. You can either do that by raising your hand. I'll be able to see that as it comes up, but you should also be able to use the chat box as well, and I think Josie will have an element of interactivity in her presentation as well. So yeah, thanks again, Josie, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. Before I start, I just want to make sure, can you see the presentation okay? And there are a few boxes for me that are blocking. I'm just not sure if they're blocking your view as well from the Zoom chat.
It's all looking good. I think we've got yeah, a couple of people have texted to say it looks great from their perspective.
Okay, great, perfect. So I guess I can leave the Zoom chat open. Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, it's really nice to virtually meet everyone. As Gail said, I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Cambridge, but I'm actually presenting on work that I did in my last position working as a postdoc for the Luke Hoffman Institute. And as the title suggests, we were looking into all of these different types of participatory approaches which are used in conservation. And it's an ongoing project, so I'm really excited to share some of the findings that are coming out of the qualitative analyses that we've done so far on these 32 cases. But it's still in progress, so we'll continue with analyses over the coming months, and then we'll be working on writing up these findings to share it more broadly. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. So first of all, what do I mean by the black box in the title? You're probably all familiar with a lot of this terminology that gets thrown around, such as co-production, collaborative governance, social learning, stewardship, the general use of participatory approaches and empowerment. And so we kind of realized that a lot of people were talking about the participatory work in many different ways, using different approaches, all claiming that it can produce more transformative outcomes to address conservation issues. And so we thought it would be really useful to better understand what are these differences. So our main research aim was to understand, looking across a bunch of different cases that use different approaches, what are the main ways in which they differ, and then what are the implications of these differences, so that we can kind of break down some of these simplistic dichotomies of calling something participatory or not participatory, and actually provide a much greater level of transparency for what people actually mean in terms of what they're doing and why. And then ultimately, we really want this work to foster dialogue and reflexivity among people who are trying to go about conservation in more collaborative ways. And so we've been doing this work in collaboration with about 40 people from different institutions around the world. And we've had some iterative processes where we've, I guess, there we go, methodology slide. I don't want to bore you with all of the specific details. I'll kind of lay out the entire process here. Basically, the thread, I was trying to think of some way of oh no, sorry, the fire alarm has just gone off. I think it's just a test. So there we go. Okay. Sorry, really poor timing.
Well managed, Josie. Thank you.
Yeah.
Stay calm.
Yeah. Yeah. Thankfully, it was just a test, so it's all gone. So here's the methodology, and I wanted to represent how I started off doing this research as someone who was trying to collaborative or do my PhD work in a collaborative way, and really struggling through all of the challenges and constraints that I faced, and not really knowing that much about what other people were doing and possible approaches. And so through that kind of, I guess, represents the small thread as it
Josie,
starts. And then, oh yeah, sure.
There are a couple of people. Perhaps if you could mute your mic if you're not speaking, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. And so through that process of iteratively working with this group of 40 people who are much more experienced in this process than me, it's been a real kind of learning experience of integrating their knowledge. And that's helped us kind of focus and figure out what concepts seem to be really interesting by which all of these cases vary, and then try to understand and do a qualitative analysis and a quantitative analysis to be able to compare them. And as I mentioned, we're still kind of in the middle of that process right now. And eventually we'll be writing these up as co-produced manuscripts between our entire group. So just to clarify exactly what we are comparing and what we're looking at. So we've focused on 103 different ways in which collaborative approaches vary. And we've focused on framing practices, rationales, capacities, and outcomes. And since this is a lot of jargon here, I'll just break down exactly what we mean. So framing refers to how the problem that collaboration is meant to help with is framed. And so an example of that is that the sustainability issue that the collaboration is meant to address can either be framed as proximate or systemic on a sliding spectrum. So something proximate would be, we need to change, an example, we need to change these people's behavior because their behavior is producing some kind of negative outcome for the environment. And a more systemic approach might ask questions like, well, why are these people, how did they develop motivations to do that in the first place? Where did that come from? How did they gain access to certain resources? What are the kind of the broader governing forces which shaped those behaviors? And then also another example of framing would be which knowledge is valued in that collaborative process. So are they valuing scientific knowledge more so? Are they valuing other forms of knowledge? So that's just an example of how collaborative processes are framing the work that they do in very different ways. Practices refers to what collaborative work is actually done by the project. So this could be the duration, how it was designed, who's involved, how it was implemented. And so we're looking at differences across all of the cases in that respect as well. Rationales were the reasons that people gave to justify the choices that they made for how to frame and do their work. And so one example of that is a decision for researchers to do the research component might be a rationale of it's more efficient. We want to make sure that the science is better. We don't want to waste local people's time if we don't think they'd be interested in it. And a different type of rationale to make a different choice, such as involving local people in that research, could be we want to empower local people. We want to improve buy-in in the results. So people would make very different rationales behind the differences in these choices. And then we also looked at capacities at individual, relational, and contextual levels, such as project leadership, the extent to which projects were spanning different boundaries, such as sectoral boundaries, cultural differences, And then also the level of support that these projects had is another example of a capacity. And then finally, we were really interested in what kinds of outcomes does this collaborative work actually produce? And that's probably what a lot of people here are especially interested in thinking about. What are the implications? And so their projects varied a lot in terms of what they were intending. So we tried to understand the extent to which different approaches are intending certain outcomes, the extent to which they've actually assessed those, and then the kind of evidence they have for what's actually been achieved. And those outcomes ranged from all sorts of things, such as producing new knowledge, promoting learning, changing policies, building institutions, certain particular social and ecological impacts, or even just producing knowledge of learning about how these collaborative approaches work. And then the vertical analysis is the second part. And so there we were really interested in trying to understand how these decisions are interlinked. So if, for example, you prioritize a rationale of maximizing empowerment, how does that shape how you actually practice collaboration compared to other people? Or if you really value scientific knowledge, how does that change how you decide to design the collaborative process and who you give power to inform those decisions? So I just, today, the plan is to give you just a quick overview of the different cases, the type of collaborative work that we're looking at. I've decided, just since there are so many intricate details in all of these 32 cases, I'm not going to dive into the case specifics here, because each of the case contributors are much more of an expert on their own work, and I want them to be able to decide eventually in our publications exactly what they want to share. And I'm also still in the process of making sure that my understanding of how these cases relate to these 103 dimensions also reflects their understanding of it. So in this webinar, I'll use basically a hypothetical scenarios to explore some of the key differences that do reflect many of the differences that are emerging between the cases, and then we'll discuss some of the implications. And then finally, we'll talk about different lessons learned from some of the cases on spanning these differences and some of the broader implications. So here's a map overview of all of the different cases. So you can see that they're very well spread out geographically in terms of where they're working at different scales. You'll notice that at the global level, that is a bit more biased towards Europe. But at all the other levels, it's kind of dispersed around the world. But it doesn't show who is actually leading, who's initiated this work around the world. And so it was quite interesting. We ended up with about 2/3 of female case contributors. It was much more researcher initiated, so it was more common for researchers to reach out to other actors to try to work together and try to produce collaborative efforts than the other way around. And then also 75% were led by OECD nationalities. So while it does look very global in nature, a lot of it's still being initiated and not necessarily as diverse of locations. And part of that is we gather these case studies from the published literature. So you'll certainly get kind of an academic bias in that way. So we've managed to look at a diversity of cases, but I think it's also really important to get a greater diversity of perspectives of different collaborative approaches. So this is kind of just one step into looking at this diversity, but we definitely will welcome future studies to look at even greater diversity. Since that map didn't really show you the scale, how some of the cases cut across a lot of different scales, I just wanted to show you all of the 32 cases in this format. And you can see that while there are 9 cases that focus only at that local level, and some cases at only higher levels, a lot of these cases are working with actors at several different scales and bridging between those groups to try to pursue a collaborative approach to addressing sustainability and conservation challenges. So the case features, a lot of sustainability issues were addressed, such as landscapes, oceans, rivers, fire, cities, supply chains, climate change, and pollination. I reflected on this because this is an illegal wildlife trade network. We actually didn't have any cases that specifically focused on that. So that would have been really interesting to include as well. And I would certainly be interested in hearing from people about what kinds of challenges you faced specifically in that context. Lots of stakeholders people are working with a whole range of stakeholders, from government, business, local communities, NGOs, often within, and then also across scales. But this varies a lot from case to case in terms of where they've decided to draw those boundaries. Many have focused on doing research on socio-ecological systems as a component of that collaboration. And then many cases have facilitated the exploration of diverse forms of knowledge, but cases have very different ideas on whose knowledge should be included and how it should interact. And just to kind of show you one example I really like, so one of our collaborators, Maria Tango, she has a really great analogy that she shared with me of kind of the difference between tributaries leading into an ocean and trying to kind of mix all the knowledge together to achieve some sort of consensus, versus thinking about different knowledge forms as kind of interwoven spaghetti strands where you're still kind of maintaining the integrity of those different knowledge systems as they interact, not necessarily to kind of meld it together into one consensus knowledge. So there are different ways in which cases think about how knowledge interacts. And then a lot of cases used really creative methods to promote social learning and reframing, such as cooperative games, painting visions, theater, gathering stories and turning it into a dynamic map, role-playing. And so it was just really, really interesting to learn about that diversity of methods that different cases are using. I'm not sure exactly how well this will work, but I thought it would be interesting to try some sort of interactive element. So I wanted to give you just kind of a hypothetical scenario, which is kind of more or less, it's more representative of some cases than others in terms of the context in which they were working. And then I wanted to give you kind of 4 different possible collaborative approaches and see kind of which of those 4 approaches resonates more or less with the people who are on this webinar. So if we could read the hypothetical scenario, the government says forest in an area will soon be designated as protected to control ongoing illegal deforestation. Local people living in the area hear about this and conflicts erupt. So there are many different kind of ways into thinking about collaborating within this context. And I just wanted to use this example as a way of thinking about our differences and then also the differences within the case. So I'm just going to give you kind of 4, I'm kind of constraining you into 4 different options, but I'll kind of explain some of the differences that are reflected within these options later. So option A is design a landscape model to maximize ecosystem services and biodiversity with local input and exploration of the findings. Option B is ask local people what their needs are and do research to address them in more sustainable ways. Option C is gather stories about local people's relationships to their landscape and use cooperative games to create a collective vision. And then finally, option D is design and facilitate role-playing games with government officials to foster empathy for local perspectives. And so I think hopefully everyone can access your chat box. If everyone clicks, I think it's under the more ... at the very top of your browser. If everyone could click on the chat box to open it. And if you could think for maybe about 30 seconds or so, for a full minute if we need, and just think about which approach seems to resonate the most with your view. And then if you could just type in the letter and very quickly just put kind of the reason why. I'm just going to do an example here. Z, and then because ... of just kind of the main reason that caused you to choose it. So if everyone could take 30 seconds to a minute or so to think about that, and as you kind of make a decision, if you could go ahead and type that into the chat box, that would be great.
Thanks, Josie. You can also access the chat at the bottom of your screen. So most people will see it's next to sort of record towards the bottom.
Okay, great. I'll just give people about 15 more seconds to share their thoughts. Okay. Yeah, so I definitely appreciate the difficulty of constraining yourself to just one option, when very often projects are much more complex than just taking one specific approach, and that's certainly the case for all of the cases that we're looking at. I think it's also interesting people use different types of rationale. So some were maybe more impact oriented, so it's more likely to deliver a certain solution, or people are more likely to accept it. Some are more process oriented, people are more likely to be engaged and find it fun. So kind of a whole different range of rationales. So I just wanted to use this example as a way in. So here are the different kind of A, B, C, D, the different options. I'm gonna introduce kind of two main dimensions or axes by which cases tended to differ. I call them false dichotomies because so they're very much real in the sense that these are clear tensions, and cases that fall more along to kind of using one approach kind of struggle to use the other approach. But at the same time, I call them false because actually several cases do manage to span this dichotomy and see it as unhelpful. And so I don't want to reinforce this dichotomy at the same time. And several cases show that it can actually be the most constructive and transformative to find ways of spanning them. So one of the ways in which these differ is that some cases are more focused on solving problems as the purpose of what they're trying to achieve with the collaboration, and then some are more focused on reframing those problems. So in the case of the first two examples, the researchers or their scientists, they had already kind of decided what is the behavior change that we're trying to achieve and what sort of modeling, what data do we need to try to solve that problem. And then it was more about kind of getting, incorporating local people's perspectives into that framing, rather than local people shaping the framing by which that's explored. And then on the bottom hand, that was actually more about letting local people frame what their needs are and frame what is the problem, and then scientists helping to address and help them with that framing. So in both cases, the original framing that the group put forward, whether it was the scientists or whether it was the local people, was never necessarily questioned. That wasn't part of the collaborative process, wasn't actually to produce that framing. That was already set. The collaborative process was used then to try to get people more involved and buy into that framing. On the right-hand side, both of those examples were much more about using a process to actually frame the issues. So using creative methods to allow either local people or government officials to frame their understanding of the issues, and then through dialogue, reframe their understanding based on how other people are framing it in different ways. So that kind of dialogue of framing back and forth. So this was one major way in which a lot of different cases varied in terms of the extent to which they focused more on one or the other. Although, as I'll continue to describe, there were cases that very much spanned both of these iteratively. And then the other dimension that was especially interesting was who was given the power to make decisions for how to do collaboration. So you'll see on the top two sides, the top two boxes. In that cases, it was very much relatively more powerful actors who decided this is how we're going to design the process. This is how we're going to take the collaborative work forward. And on the left case, it was the researchers who decided how to, what knowledge is needed to address what problem. And on the right-hand side, government officials who are potentially in a more powerful position than other actors in that area. They were given the power in the sense that they were given the power to frame and reframe. Whereas on the bottom, you can see, so it was more kind of marginalized perspectives that were given power. In the left-hand side, they were given power to frame the problem and the solution. And on the right-hand side, they were given the power to explore their framings in a process that encouraged them to reframe it based on the discussions that they had. So hopefully I should say that these are just two of the 103 dimensions that we looked at, just because it's a bit, I just kind of wanted to focus on two especially interesting axes. And then to discuss some of the implications, I'll share some of the ways in which taking these two approaches on why to do collaboration and how to do it can create certain types of opportunities, but then also certain types of risks and challenges. So now I'll go around from A to B to C to D and just share some of those implications. So for A, so where the researchers had the power to decide what scientific data would be useful, a lot of really kind of interesting and novel understanding of social ecological systems can be produced in this way to question certain assumptions, because there's just so much we don't understand about these systems and how they work. It can help efficiently spread approaches that are working well, because since it's very solution focused and more powerful actors are implementing it, it's so resource intensive to do a lot of collaborative work. Sometimes it might make sense to just kind of push forward things that kind of have good evidence that they have a good chance of working well. Some of the risks and challenges, though, with this cases that more so took this perspective is that very often just natural science disciplines were holding the power in choosing what data needed to be collected and how, and framing the problem. And that's a challenge in the sense that different disciplines would probably frame those problems, choose different kinds of data, just in very different ways. And so there's a bit of concern that it could be a very narrow perspective or way of thinking about problems and solutions compared to what it could be by focusing on incorporating other disciplines as well. The problem framing focused more on proximate causes. So how can we change this farmer's behavior as opposed to higher level, more kind of systemic influences and people that might be involved. So that could be a challenge if you're trying to kind of affect sustainability transformation. It could be a bit of a challenge if you're always focused on kind of the proximate or symptoms of deeper rooted issues. There was also a challenge of fetishizing the role of new scientific data for change. There was this assumption that if you generate this new knowledge from these models, then that will lead to a whole bunch of knock-on effects of changing people's perspectives, changing policies. So that knowledge was really given a lot of power and prioritized for thinking that would cause a lot of changes down the road compared to other cases. And then the outcomes were very defined early on, but that could also inhibit the possibility for different sorts of unexpected emergent outcomes. And then, as I mentioned, it was generally less collaborative. So the scientists more so framed, this is the type of model that would be useful. We want to, focus on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And then it was more about understanding which ecosystem services are important to certain local actors. So getting input in that way. And then very often the scientists would have more of a role in actually doing the research than in other cases. And so I guess the risk of that is that if the way that you're collecting the data and you're framing the problem by trying to understand more about that very much feeds into that original framing and reinforces it. And so that could serve to reinforce the narratives that different people have about why environmental problems are happening and what are possible solutions. And that perceived objectivity of that process of doing science can also hide this logic. And very often these choices were justified by rationales of having control over the process, making it more efficient and maximizing impact. So the second the second approach of using research and work to kind of understand and address local people's needs, it had a rationale of humility. So we need to really understand what are people's needs, what is their way of seeing these different problems, and helps kind of empower those framings of more marginalized groups. But some of the challenges were the risk of romanticizing marginalized voices. So that way of framing the problem could be very locally focused and very proximate. So again, ignoring some of those more systemic influences. Again, it could fetishize the role of scientific data when the emphasis was on doing research to address these local understandings of problems, because it might not necessarily be needing to generate only new knowledge, but there might be a lot of other political dynamics going on. There's also this issue of representation. So the local voice that is framing the problem might not actually, you might kind of see that as the marginalized voice, since it's a kind of a local community member, but given all of the politics in those settings, it can very much be the more elite or powerful voice, which is not necessarily representing a lot of views within that community. And then in many cases, there was a risk of these research findings being co-opted by other more powerful actors for their own purposes. Moving on to the third example of trying to facilitate process of reframing among more marginalized actors. So it created a safe space for marginalized views to reframe by excluding the powerful actors and keeping them on the outside, and trying to create kind of a safer space, really facilitated or allowed people to share their perspectives. And allowed people to kind of reframe some of the dominant problematic narratives and see things in new ways. Some of the risks were that because a rationale for doing this kind of work was so focused on inclusivity and empowerment, sometimes processes would just invite kind of whoever wants to be involved to the table. But some cases showed that actually gatekeeping is really essential to keep that a safe space and be able to properly facilitate those conversations to allow for reframing. And you need just a really legitimate process. Several cases show the power of using those creative methods, like some of the examples I mentioned earlier. One huge challenge was that since power is being left outside of the process, it can really constrain what goes on. So there might be a lot of reframing that happens within those more marginalized actors. But if the powerful actors on the outside don't share that view or don't really care, and they continue to constrain it in certain ways, that can be really limiting for the impacts of that kind of work. And then there was a risk of these efforts being co-opted by more powerful people as well. And similar, this could also kind of fetishize the role of that local knowledge, not necessarily scientific knowledge, but the knowledge of those actors to be able to change power dimensions outside of that space, because the more powerful actors aren't actually involved in the process. And so it often required lots of reframing work, not just at that local level, but across different scales. And then finally, the final example efforts where you're working actually with kind of more powerful actors, such as government officials, and trying to facilitate those processes of framing and reframing those views. So powerful actors were engaged in the reframing process. So instead of leaving them on the outside, it actually gave them a lot more potential to reframe their narratives, not just by being told certain knowledge, but actually engaging them. So again, a lot of implications for being able to actually reframe those potentially problematic narratives. But there were a lot of lessons learned and a lot of challenges. So gatekeeping was extremely essential to create a safe space. And what I mean by gatekeeping is deciding who to exclude. So in order to allow more powerful actors to reframe, it was actually really unhelpful to have NGOs or local actors present in that space, because it created more of a need to kind of defend one's own perspective or demonstrate that they're doing things to address certain problems. And so kind of by keeping those politics out, it actually created a much safer space to allow for reframing. And because many powerful actors don't necessarily want to reframe, it's not a very kind of appealing selling point if it's not arguing that we're going to help you specifically address this problem or create this solution. And that reframing might even be against certain interests. Active targeting, figuring out who to involve, and really being persistent on trying to get them engaged, working with people who are slightly more interested, who are within their social spheres, and kind of pulling through different networks was really important. And again, really creative methods that are not always used with those types of groups, and using very inspirational figures was incredibly important. And also how, since marginalized actors aren't necessarily present, how their views are brought in and represented is really important for the extent for how powerful actors decide to reframe their own views. And then finally, there was still a risk of vested interest co-opting the process. So powerful actors just kind of using that collaborative process to pursue their own interests, but not necessarily being interested in reframing. So lots of challenges there. I think this approach to collaboration was especially interesting because I think it was the rarest among all of the cases, probably just because it's so difficult and time consuming. And I think maybe when we tend to work with powerful actors, we tend to try to include the NGOs and all the other groups at the same time. So I thought that was especially interesting. And then, but by working with powerful groups, there is always that risk of just reinforcing their power. So another risk to be aware of. So I want to leave enough time for discussion and questions. So I just wanted to quickly talk about, I really don't want to reinforce these dichotomies. I think, as many of you mentioned in the group chat, it's really useful to think about spanning, kind of taking, how can you take all of these approaches? What are useful ways of spanning these dichotomies? And there were a lot of examples across the cases of trying to leave enough of a process for reframing problems and giving enough space to that so that people were in a better position to then be a bit more solution focused, and then iteratively testing out solutions and creating more space to reframe whether those solutions are working, and foster learning to be able to reframe the understanding of problems over time, instead of just getting set into a specific model of, yes, we have our solution, we have a lot of vested interest and stake in showing this, that this is solving problems and will continue to solve problems, and being kind of stuck in that route. And there were examples of this at the powerful, working with powerful actors between scientists and CEOs, for example, and examples of this, of working with more marginalized actors, of trying to balance actually addressing some of their needs at the same time as promoting reframing. And then at the same time, it's very difficult to span this dichotomy of how do you effectively collaborate with both powerful groups and more marginalized groups at the same time. And I thought there were some really interesting examples of, I guess, on the reframing side of trying to reframe a lot within that local setting. And then and then trying to reframe within kind of that more powerful safe space, and then trying to understand what are ways of then combining these perspectives and joining conversations together in a respectful, stepwise process. And then for solving problems, there were definitely cases of scientists having more power originally, but as they developed more relationships and really long-term collaborations with people, a very kind of iterative relationship back and forth of people across all different power levels inputting into deciding what the problems were and bringing their framing to the table to address certain issues and decide what solutions to pursue. So I think that this bridging work, it requires creating reframing within safe spaces, as I mentioned. So a respectful process for bridging across conflict and power barriers. It really requires legitimate and neutral, or as neutral as possible, people to be able to coordinate, understand these differences in knowledge and values, cultural differences, and then understand how to work with those groups separately, bring in other perspectives from outside, and how to eventually bridge those spaces and bring those groups together. And then it requires negotiating diverse rationales of actors involved. So just for example, if you're trying to do a participatory process and you're facing really severe constraints from something above, how can you actually understand the rationales that group is using to put that constraint on you, and then use your own rationales and kind of reframe those rationales in a way that they'll understand, so that you can lift those constraints. So if a policy process says you only have 2 months to incorporate these perspectives into our report, which would be useful to kind of create more diversity in our report, then actually being able to argue we can't do that in 2 months. We actually need a much longer time and a certain type of process to be able to properly incorporate those perspectives and not have it just be superficial, but actually a legitimate way of joining, of exploring their knowledge and keeping its integrity. So some of just the broader implications to end. I think it's really important to recognize the value of all of these approaches. I very much focused on the risks and challenges because those might be overlooked, especially if someone's really working in that space. But I think there's a lot of value to be had in all of these approaches. And I think maybe we're all somewhat coming from different directions from our disciplinary training or the different norms in which we work for how we should do collaboration. And so I think it's really interesting and useful to be aware of all of these other approaches. And maybe actually if we think that would be a really useful approach, but I'm not at all familiar with that, then at least this gives us some kind of understanding of who we could reach out to or how we can bridge our work with other people's work, both within and across scales, to hopefully use collaboration to create more transformative outcomes. Just to wrap up, I can't thank all of the different co-authors of this work who have been involved in kind of to varying degrees, some in contributing cases, some in really interrogating the framings throughout the process and coming to several day-long workshops. And we just can't thank them enough for all of their input and their continued input as we continue with all of this work. And then I especially want to recognize the role of the different organizations which have supported this work, especially so the Luke Hoffman Institute has been driving this. The UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Center has kind of hosted us here in Cambridge to be based here. The Pew Charitable Trust put a lot of work into originally conceiving of this idea, and the Center for Collaborative Conservation, and they've continued to be involved. And the Center for Collaborative Conservation has been really instrumental in supporting this work, especially kind of the main workshop that brought people together to interrogate this framing. So I just want to thank everyone, and I'm really curious to hear more about other people's experience, and hopefully we'll try to answer any questions the best of my ability that people have. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Josie. That's fascinating and clearly a very huge not only set of research tasks, but the analysis is very powerful. I think certainly value co-creation is a key aspect of social marketing, as we know, and it's something that in my own experience over the years I always think it takes so long, and sometimes it really works, and sometimes you just don't have that magic ingredient. And to me, I always felt it was quite relationship and situationally dependent, but it's clear from your analysis that's not true. So it's very helpful to have sort of a set of recommendations to help guide practitioners as we're thinking about behaviour change outcomes. Yeah, excellent, thank you. I've got a couple of questions, but I'm going to open the floor first to see if people would like to pitch in and ask Josie some either points of clarification or for advice based on their own circumstances.
Yep, sure.
I think Marcus, I might not see the hands because you're hosting, so feel free to pitch in and explain whose hand's up. Nobody, they're all so shy.
I also recognize that it's a lot of information. I have a tendency to kind of throw a lot of information into, into presentations.
Right. I maybe I'll kick off then. So I have a practical question. The study, when is it going to be published? Are you in the process of doing the paper, or is there something online? I found the grid at the end very useful, and the summary of each of the risks and challenges. I felt that was quite powerful information that we can access.
So what we're trying to do right now, originally this was a very qualitative focused analysis, but we thought actually to be able to kind of understand from a quantitative perspective of how different cases are positioned across these various continuums. And we actually, kind of the dimensions that I showed you with the problem, the focus on the problem reframing or the solution focus, those are actually two separate dimensions. So it allows us to show how some cases very much do both of those. And so we're doing that quantitative analysis because we really we feel like that will reveal a lot more detail about the interconnections, and we can do a cluster analysis to show which cases tend to take similar approaches. So that's what we're finishing up right now to supplement the qualitative work. We'll be working on the publications over the next several months. And hope to have that out. There's a bit of a delay with the scientific publication process, but basically trying to get that out as soon as we can. And share that as widely in terms of the final findings.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll go across to Sarah, not Jeremy. Thanks, Sarah. Feel free to unmute and go ahead.
Thanks very much, Gail, and thank you, Josie, for your presentation, which I thought was really interesting. Just a question, really. The four options that you gave us, for me, so just to explain, I'm a former senior civil servant in the UK government. And your option of just talking to government officials, I didn't choose that one because for me that is a kind of separate approach. Government officials see other government officials as trusted people who understand them. And so if you want to persuade them that there's a particular change that needs to happen in a particular landscape, then you would talk to them in their framing. And that would be really, really different from how you would talk to anybody else, either an NGO, the community chiefs, the marginalised people. It would be so totally different that for me, that was almost like a separate process, which is why I didn't mention it in my response. But so I'm pretty surprised you kind of put it in there because it felt to me like it was an outlier.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think so often when we do focus on addressing or taking collaborative approaches, it is kind of so focused on the proximate actors, so the local people that are closest to these places. But I mean, in that case, it was actually, so the government officials were putting this reserve on the map. So they were very much involved in what caused that conflict. And I think there are definitely people that try to go to more powerful groups and very much frame in their language. So with businesses, maybe argue for the profitability of engaging in this collaboration or engaging in this work, and for government actors kind of trying to appeal to their interests. But what I found so interesting about some of the work is that I think there is a lot of potential for not making those assumptions about what those framings are, still trying to understand them and take that into account, but trying to use more creative processes that bring in other perspectives and try to kind of stimulate reframing instead of just going and then just kind of assuming that you should go with that dominant framing. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I think we don't really understand how those reframing processes work very well. So I think there's a lot to be learned. But I think there's great potential.
I think that's right. I think the only thing I'd say is it's going to be different in different countries, because the framing is often political. And although the policymakers are not political, what they're doing is delivering for the politicians. So it's quite complex, and you kind of need an inside voice to be telling you, actually, that approach is really not going to hit the mark, if you like. Because what is driving the policy or the practical kind of approach to the area for so many different reasons. And you really need to know that to strike it right with the officials.
Yeah, and it's so tricky to know when is this framing okay, and we should just try to use collaboration to get people more on board with this framing, and when do we actually need to use collaboration to question this framing, because that's really the root of the problem. Yeah,
agreed.
Great stuff. Thanks, both of you. Any other questions? I can't see.
I have a question.
Please.
My name's Carlos Hasman. I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development in Washington, D.C. I had a question regarding the power and how it was framed, the criteria to decide, if government or researchers have more power than marginalized local peoples. Marginalized local leaders might have extreme power at a very local level, but not on the national level. So how did you guys discriminate that?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a really important point, that power is always such a relative concept. So just as certain local actors can be viewed as more marginalized or more powerful depending on who the relative group is, scientists as well. Scientists can be seen as very powerful in certain contexts, but also very powerless within maybe higher level decision-making processes that they feel like they can't really influence in certain ways that they want to. And so ultimately we were trying to understand, so for that framing of that powerful group, I guess in terms of the problem which they were interested in addressing, power in the sense that they were the group that had control over the funds and how to use them and how to design that process. So I guess we were framing power over collaboration in terms of having control over the funds and that code and that design process and that implementation process.
Okay.
So that very much could be scientists or it could be certain local actors. But for some reason in the cases, I guess because we were so focused on published cases and very kind of researcher-led work, a lot of times those were researcher-led. It was only in some cases that power was more so delegated to other actors for certain rationales of trying to empower people or being really process-focused.
Okay, yeah, and the follow-on question regarding, did you take into consideration the differences in government structures and government that provides power to the people and other governments that are more autocratic?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to look into more government-led collaborative efforts. We didn't really have that. I have to say we didn't really have that many examples, and I think that reflects kind of a limitation of the sampling that we're looking at. So I'm not sure. We did look at the involvement, how governments were involved in certain processes, and there were differences. I mean, there was a case where the government actually initiated the collaborative work, and they basically framed the problems, and then they wanted scientists to help answer those questions. And then there were other cases where the researchers were really struggling to engage the government officials, and it was just kind of a real struggle to get them engaged and involved and interested. But I'm not sure we really had that many government-led examples, maybe just one or two.
Okay, great. Thank you very much again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. So it's sort of one of the things I reflected upon. Detty was on the call earlier. I think she might have dropped off by now, but it's very interesting for that type of work that they. So Detty works for Recoft. It's very interesting for potential application where you're in direct interaction with communities. I guess one of the challenges we have for demand reduction and tackling illegal wildlife trade, the markets are sometimes very diffuse. And while I think there's real value in helping to co-design sort of messages that will influence consumers to buy one product over another or not buy something, it makes me reflect a little bit on the analysis process. Did you filter out sort of differences like that? Where you're actually trying to shift markets rather than and shift a biodiversity circumstance, or did you do any filter that was about work in Asia in particular, where there are differences in the results according to geographic sort of filters like that? Anything that you might
so in terms of geographical influences, that is one of the features of how the work is practiced, that we're kind of putting a quantitative score on to then try to explore whether that is linked to any decisions and how the collaborative work is done. I'm afraid we haven't done that quantitative analysis yet. We're reaching that stage just now. So I can't really say much about what the particular implications are of kind of geographical focus. In terms of looking at markets, I think it would be especially interesting to learn more about certain collaborative efforts that are looking into markets and supply chains, and how kind of consumer demand and needs are framed. We had very few cases that were looking at that, and they were kind of trying to gather knowledge of how the supply chain works to then be able to inform decision making. I'm not sure if I really answered your question. If you want to follow on with any further question to clarify a bit further.
No, it's okay. I guess it's I see the nature of community engagement in biodiversity protection or in situ, kind of making sure that people have access to natural goods and services. I see that as very related to this type of analysis, but where it's markets, it made me reflect a little bit. Actually often power centers are people like big companies who are marketing goods and services in maybe a different way to the way that the case studies that you've presented would show.
No, I see what you mean. And also kind of the literature, I guess the original literature on co-production was very much focused on services generation. So
exactly,
we want to deliver this particular service. How can we even companies can very effectively use co-production practices by trying to get that consumer input to know how to better sell the product. So, I guess in that case, I would put it in the category of the company very much has the power in framing what they're trying to achieve. And it's only within that framing that they try to get input on how to do that better, instead of leaving space for people to actually be framing what the service should be, because the company, I guess, already has a very strong vested interest in delivering that service, so that is their solution that they want to push forward. So I see it as one particular form of collaboration.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it'd be really interesting to conduct perhaps a follow-up piece of research on that. And if you need case study kind of information, and perhaps we can put a call out to members of the community of practice so that we can start to analyse these types of influential factors. I think we just don't know enough or understand enough about how to make value co-creation and a social marketing initiative work. And then there's a secondary consideration about the differences between social marketing to promote uptake of a good versus social marketing to disrupt people buying things and change the behavior that way.
Exactly. And then kind of questioning, well, who decides whether is this already is this a good service to be delivering, or who decided that? How can that be questioned certain ways? And how can kind of that process be opened up to inform that as well?
Yeah, fascinating. It's very thought-provoking. There were lots of different points in your presentation where I was thinking, I want to ask this question now. But thanks.
We should definitely get a coffee sometime soon.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't
chatting
even
about
thought
this.
of that opportunity. That's great. Okay, because we have that opportunity, just double checking that nobody else has any questions. I took over a bit at the end there. Sorry about that. Thanks very much, Noi, for your question in the chat box. I've picked that up, and yes, we'll share the recording. No worries. Kelly has asked the idea of disruption. Demarketing might be a good topic for a future webinar. We've we've done a little bit about that before, but maybe I'll drop you a line about that.
Oh yeah, I'm not very familiar with that, but it sounds fascinating. So I would love to hear
Sounds
more
great.
about that.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. All right. Well, it's been great to talk to everybody. We've now reached our hour limit, so thanks very much for everybody's participation, and thanks hugely, Josie, for taking this on. I was really pleased that we were able to get this new insight, because I know you've only just got to this point in the analysis. So thanks so much for sharing it. And
no worries. It's always great to force yourself to gather your thoughts together and to get people's feedback and questions at a middle stage of the analysis, and instead of when it's all polished and published
and out there,
and you have to just defend it.
That's great. Thank you. There's lots of great compliments coming in the chat line there as well. So thanks so much. We'll stop the recording now and bid everybody a very good rest of their day, and look forward to speaking to you again next month.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.